Every patient who gets admitted to a hospital floor answers the same short list of intake questions, asked the same way, in the same order, by whoever is doing the paperwork that day, and one of those questions, depending on how it gets answered, is the actual reason a stranger was sitting in the chair by your father's bed last night. The heart monitor didn't do that. The fall risk checklist didn't do that. A single answer, given during ordinary intake, did. Most people who've lived through a parent getting a hospital sitter assume it's about behavior. Pulling at a line, trying to climb over a bed rail, wandering toward a door at 3 in the morning. That's real, and it happens plenty. But there's a second, completely separate reason. A continuous observer shows up, and it has nothing to do with anything the patient did. It's written into a national safety standard that applies to every unit in the building, including the ordinary medical floor where somebody lands for a hip or a heart problem, and almost no family ever hears its name. The standard comes from the Joint Commission, the group that accredits hospitals, and it says that any patient on any unit who screens as high risk on a suicide risk questionnaire gets placed under constant one-to-one visual observation. One staff member assigned to that patient and no one else close enough to physically step in for as long as the flag stays up. The room gets swept too, cords put away, sharps removed, certain equipment reconsidered, on a cardiac floor that was never built to be a psychiatric unit and doesn't have to become one, because the order isn't about the building, it's about what got written down on a form. Before I get further into how that screening actually plays out, I want to tell you why I keep making these. It's not that you need convincing to stay, it's that the gap between what a hospital is required to do and what a family actually gets told about it doesn't close on its own, and there's a lot more of it than any one video covers. Staying subscribed just means you run into the next piece of it before you need it, instead of after. Here's how the suicide risk observation actually gets triggered, because it isn't a diagnosis anyone makes, it's a screening tool, asked as routine intake, the kind of thing a spouse admitted for a hip or a heart problem answers without thinking twice about it. A positive answer triggers a follow-up assessment. If that comes back high risk, the room gets its sweep, and a dedicated observer is assigned, watching only that one patient, including through toileting and bathing, because the standard is written that specifically. And downgrading it later isn't like downgrading a fall risk sitter, where calmer behavior is enough. The suicide risk flag has to be cleared on its own terms before the observer goes away. There's a detail on how this gets staffed that I think says something. Hospitals have been moving toward cheaper remote camera monitoring for a lot of routine observation. A screen in a control room watching several rooms at once instead of paying a person to sit in one. For this specific category, the Joint Commission's own guidance draws a hard line. A camera can supplement the watch, but it cannot replace a live person able to physically intervene unless being in the room is actually unsafe for staff. Out of everything I've read about how hospitals are cutting costs on observation, this is the one place where the rule still insists on an actual human being in the chair, and I think that tells you something about what's assumed to be at stake. And the reason this particular trigger matters more than people expect isn't abstract. Men 85 and older have the highest suicide rate of any demographic group tracked in the country. Over 55 deaths per 100,000 in the most recent federal data, more than double the overall national rate. More than half of the roughly 49,000 suicide deaths recorded in a recent year were people 45 and older, and the rate specifically among people 65 and up climbed more than 8% in a single year, even while some younger age groups held flat. So an ordinary hospitalization, a fractured hip, a cardiac event, for an older man in particular carries a real chance that a routine screening question gets answered honestly, maybe for the first time in front of someone holding a clipboard. And the room changes because of that answer, not because of anything the family saw coming. Everything up to this point has been about something happening inside a patient's body or mind. What I want to walk you through next isn't medical at all. It's a piece of paper, and which state that paper gets signed in can end up mattering more than anything a doctor actually decides. But there's a second physical trigger worth knowing first, because it hides in plain sight. Someone's admitted for pneumonia, or a fracture, or surgery, something that has nothing to do with drinking. Then, 24 to 72 hours in, with no more alcohol reaching their system, withdrawal starts, tremor, sweating, confusion that climbs instead of settling. Staff score it hourly on a tool called the CIWA R scale, and a rising score triggers medication and closer bedside monitoring, sometimes a formal one-to-one observer if agitation or fall risk escalates with it. Here's the part that catches families off guard. Older patients are less likely to volunteer a drinking history in the first place, and clinicians catch alcohol misuse in roughly only 1 out of 3 older hospitalized patients where it's actually present. So, what's really withdrawal can look, to a family and even briefly to some of the staff, exactly like an unexplained bout of hospital confusion with no clear cause. One case report describes a patient admitted for an unrelated infection who looked completely stable for the first 2 days, then on day 3 spiked into tremor and racing vitals consistent with full delirium tremens, requiring an urgent shift into that same monitoring protocol. Now, the legal trigger. Every state has its own separate law letting a hospital hold a patient against their will for psychiatric evaluation, and the differences between states are not small. A 50-state legal review found hold lengths ranging from a low of 23 hours in one state up to 10 days in 2 others, with 72 hours the most common ceiling. Only 22 of those 50 states guarantee any judicial review of the hold at all, and only 9 require a judge to certify it before the person is even hospitalized. Only 31 states let a mental health professional, as opposed to police or a physician, be the one who initiates the hold in the first place. In New York, for instance, the law allows what's informally called the 2PC pathway, 2 physicians certifying the need through a specific provision of the state's mental hygiene code. None of that is a national standard. It's 50 separate answers to the same question. Which brings me to a case that's still working its way through federal court, so I'll say plainly this is one man's allegation, not a settled fact, but it shows exactly how this can happen to someone whose actual problem was medical, not psychiatric. A 66-year-old man with diabetes fainted from low blood sugar in a laundromat and was taken to an emergency room. He says that despite being calm, having no psychiatric history, and needing to get home to his elderly mother, a doctor asked whether he needed to see a psychiatrist, and he was held. He's now suing over it. Whatever a court eventually decides about that specific case, the pattern it describes is real. The legal threshold for danger can get applied to someone whose actual issue never had anything to do with mental illness, especially the moment confusion or distress shows up in the room. And underneath both of these threads sits something legal scholars have flagged as a genuine gap, not a rare edge case. Civil commitment law was written with psychiatric illness in mind, not for an elderly patient whose only danger is dementia-related agitation. A comparative legal review found that hospitals handle this inconsistently across the country. Some medical directors will treat a family member's power of attorney as sufficient authority to hold a confused elderly patient, while others insist on running the full involuntary psychiatric commitment process for the same kind of case. 2 hospitals, 2 towns apart, might reach for completely different legal tools to hold the same confused grandparent, one asking the family to sign a form, the other filing an actual psychiatric hold. I'm not a nurse, and I'm not diagnosing anyone watching this. What I'm describing is how the system decides who gets watched and under what authority. What to actually do with any of it belongs to you and the people caring for your family member in that specific room. What I keep coming back to out of all 3 of these is that none of them require anyone to have done anything wrong. The screening question gets asked exactly the way it's supposed to be asked. The withdrawal scale gets scored exactly the way it's supposed to be scored. The state law gets followed exactly as it's written, wherever you happen to be standing when it applies to you. And somehow that's the part of this whole thing I've never quite gotten used to.